Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. All right. Hey, guys. Next episode, I have my coffee. My name's Connor, if you're new. Hello. I like reacting to history stuff and doing things. And yeah, hit all the buttons. Original link to the video, top of the description. I recommend watching the previous 3 episodes here, but that's up to you. It feels like we're about to, we're at like the top of that hill on the roller coaster, and it feels like stuff's about to really happen this episode. So let's go. If you aren't ready to learn, there's the door. You're in the wrong class.
September 28th, Philadelphia. The Liberty Loan Parade is in full swing. Thousands march in the streets. Hundreds of thousands watch. Few know that health officials have pressured the mayor to cancel the event. Women wave flags. A child sits on his father's shoulders. The crowd falls silent for a simulated bombing run. Airplanes buzz overhead. Anti-aircraft guns fire blanks into the sky. The crowd, necks craned, tries to imagine what it's like to be in mortal peril. Little do they know, they already are.
Let's do it.
The flu was already burning in Philadelphia, but after the Liberty Loan Parade, it explodes. 3 days later, the hospitals start to fill. With the war,
I thought like a plane was going to crash. I'm an idiot.
it explodes. 3 days later, the hospitals start to fill. With the war sapping medical professionals, there aren't enough doctors or nurses, and the hospital staff starts to die. Though colleagues fall around them, doctors and nurses stay at their posts. Some in private practice make 60 house calls a day. Over 1,000 die that first week, and in 3 weeks, the death toll approaches 5,000. The dead quickly begin to overwhelm Philadelphia. Morticians post staff at hospitals to free up beds the moment victims expire. If a patient starts turning blue, nurses tag them for the morgue. It saves time.
Jesus. Imagine that. Maybe they're so maybe they're so delirious at this point that they don't really notice being pushed off, or seeing the nurse make this decision. But imagine you are pretty conscious and you just see yourself just like you're gonna be a corpse pretty soon, and just having to deal with that mentally, and knowing that they really don't have a choice because there are, what's even more horrible, there's like 1,000 more people, or 5,000 just like you. More than that. I think that was the death numbers or whatnot. That's terrifying. Continue.
But the morgue is out of space and refuses to accept more bodies. Workers keep doors and windows open to dissipate the stench, and fluid runs out the door and into the gutter. The Catholic Church gets involved, mobilizing clergy to help clear the backlog. When the priests enter the morgue, they find 400 bodies. They're everywhere. Lying on desks and stacked in corners, the building is at 12 times its maximum capacity. Things are no better at graveyards. Pre-burial vaults are full. The city has run out of coffins and wood to build coffins. People use wheelbarrows and potato sacks to bring loved ones to the cemetery, then leave them there. Once again,
I was going to say, are there mass graves or something like that? I'm sure there were, but they would just leave him there?
The church steps in, hiring a construction crew to dig trenches with steam shovels. They stack the coffins 2 deep while recording exactly where each person is buried. At night, citizens hear them reciting Latin prayers over the mass grave. But that took time to organize. And for weeks, thousands are not buried at all. With hospitals, morgues, and cemeteries refusing to accept corpses, people have to live with the dead in their homes. And many families are so ill that they can't move a corpse at all, and simply sleep, eat, and live next to the deceased. Weeks in, Philadelphia leaders finally rent a warehouse as an
1 sec, guys. Sorry. All right. Sorry.
Organized teams of policemen and priests circle into warehouse as an overflow morgue. Organized teams of policemen and priests circle the city, collecting the dead in horse-drawn carts. Philadelphia would be the worst hit city in America, with 500,000 cases. By the
I mean, that's bad, but I thought that was going to be deaths for a second.
end of October, the city government almost ceased to function, and private citizens stepped in to run the response. People volunteered cars as ambulances and worked as dispatchers at medical phone banks, a primitive 911. But just up the coast, it was a different story. While the head of New York's Board of Health had been slow to respond, the city had experience fighting epidemics like polio and tuberculosis. The Public Health Service had a major presence and experience screening and quarantining people at the Port of New York. In fact, the port had started quarantining ships the moment reports of the flu arose on the Western Front. But the war made full quarantine impossible. The city instituted laws criminalizing spitters and people who failed to cover their mouths when they coughed or sneezed. They posted criminalizing spitters and people who failed to cover their mouths. The city instituted laws criminalizing spitters and people who failed to cover their mouths when they coughed or sneezed.
Criminalizing, so is that arrested?
Notices urging the sick to stay home under voluntary quarantine, report illnesses to a doctor, and they called for people to wear gauze masks. The Board of Health surveyed neighborhoods to track the spread. They set up medical centers that dispatched doctors and nurses on house calls. And most importantly, they convinced businesses to stagger working hours and shopping times, reducing crowds on public transit. But even in New York, the press continued to minimize the outbreak in order to protect morale. And it was the same in cities and towns across America, even as the disease spread west. Newspapers would claim there was nothing to worry about one day, and then the next announced that all public gathering places were closed. The result was uncertainty and fear. Gathering places were closed. The result was uncertainty and fear. Everyone knew newspapers were covering it up. People could see the obituaries. They saw the Red Cross ads begging for nurses. Families tracked the flu coming down the rail line or highway via letters and articles buried in the back pages. It was in the next state, the next county, the next town, and finally next door. In this climate of mistrust, rumors grew.
I want to make sure it's loud enough for you guys, right?
One conspiracy theory claimed the flu was a bioweapon released from German U-boats off the Atlantic.
All right, sorry.
Door. In this climate of mistrust, rumors grew. One conspiracy theory claimed the flu was a bioweapon released from German U-boats off the Atlantic coast. Another said that the German-owned Bayer Corporation had poisoned its aspirin with the disease. A rumor ran around Phoenix that dogs carried the disease, and as a result, Arizonians killed thousands of strays and pets. And in San Francisco, a policeman shot a man who refused to comply with new flu.
I was probably more upset at that than I was at any of the other human numbers, which doesn't say. It's all terrible.
Mask laws. Evangelist Billy Sunday claimed the disease was a punishment visited upon a sinful nation and held a mass prayer meeting to end the epidemic. Several in the crowd collapsed of flu while praying for deliverance. Whole towns isolated themselves, hiring armed guards. The flu got in anyway, arriving with mailmen and milk trucks. Shops began asking customers to shout their orders, then leave the money on the doorstep. The owner would take the money and leave the goods. Children distilled this paranoia into a jump rope rhyme, one that captured the sense of an unwanted visitor invading the home.
Isn't the Black Death Ring Around the Rosie, too? What is it with children rhymes and plague?
I had a little bird and her name was Enza. I opened up the window and influenza.
The country needs something to stop this nightmare.
Good, kids.
At the Rockefeller Institute, they isolate Pfeiffer's bacillus in mid-October, and the Army Medical School begins the process of injecting it into horses, drawing their blood, and isolating the antibodies for a vaccine. By October 25th, the vaccine is ready. Express trains rush deliveries to the West Coast to protect troops and shipbuilders there. They've made enough to vaccinate the entire U.S. Army and its civilian employees, but only enough for the Army.
I was going to say, it's only, middle of episode 4. I have a feeling.
For the duration of the war, the Rockefeller Institute was a military organization, and therefore their work focused on the military. No matter how much mayors and governors begged for vaccine, they wouldn't receive a single vial. It took a parallel civilian effort to provide relief to the public.
Sorry, I had to double check. So they were prioritizing the military. Understood.
At the New York Hygienic Lab, Williams labors over lung samples from hospitals and orphanages, trying to find whether Pfeiffer's exists in a majority of victims. And she finds it. Everywhere. She isolates a sample and proves antibodies can bind to it, further confirming it was the culprit. That done, she cultures vast quantities of Pfeiffer's, liter upon liter, then hands them off to Park, who rushes upstate to mass-produce vaccine at his farm. Deep down, researchers knew this was not good science. The process had been too fast. No one really knew whether Pfeiffer's caused the flu, and if, as some suspected, the culprit was a virus invisible to microscopes, these vaccines would do nothing. It was, one researcher said,
I guess the thought process was a bit hasty now that you look back at it, just because it bound to it, and then you're hoping you found it.
like fighting a ghost. Still, it was worth trying. There was a possibility they'd accidentally snare the disease-causing agent in their sample, and the horses would make antibodies for it. That was how the first rabies vaccine happened, after all. In fact, one Rockefeller researcher counted on this, producing a vaccine that contained antibodies for every bacteria he could find, all mixed together, hoping that one would stop the disease.
What?
Even as they rolled out the vaccine, Surgeon General Gorgas cautioned it was experimental, and no one knew if it would work. And
Just I don't know how feasible it is. Maybe it's a really good idea, but just throw everything in there. Oh God. Okay.
it didn't. Labs across the country produced dozens of vaccines,
laughing.
and none of them prevented flu.
Just
Because
seems-
flu was,
yeah.
as some feared, an invisible virus. Yet despite that failure, medical science was not helpless. They could do little for patients killed directly by the flu, the ones that turned blue, but they could fight the
Dr.
opportunistic pneumonias that followed it. The anti-pneumonia vaccine in serum Avery had worked on during the earlier measles epidemic was effective and likely saved some people. Thousands of troops took it. On the surgical side, doctors developed a new procedure to enter the lungs and drain the sacs of pus that drowned patients. Others used oxygen, x-rays, and cardiac stimulants to support ailing victims. But nurses provided the most valuable care. There were too few doctors, too many patients, not enough medicine, and what treatments they had often took too long to administer en masse. Nurses, on the other hand, could keep patients hydrated, warm, and breathing comfortably. They could ease coughs and lower temperatures. And that kind of long-term care probably affected a patient's survival more than anything a doctor could do in the few minutes they had at each bedside. Added to that, the Red Cross developed a system that predicted the flu's cycle of infection, when it would die down in one area and spring up in another, letting them deploy emergency teams of nurses before they were needed. But as everyone from city officials and the Red Cross responded to the crisis, there was one man who refused to do anything: President Wilson. When briefed about the deadly influenza outbreak, the one question on his mind was whether he should order the troop ships to continue ferrying soldiers to France. He did, and the flu kept killing.
Sorry, it's just a great episode, and stuff's ramping up, obviously, and some I love the tactic of just hoping one cures it and just tossing all of those. So the antibodies of a bunch of known diseases or whatnot, and then just throwing it in one, I think is comical. But who knows? Maybe it was a smart gesture. But what was I about to say?
Carrying break. The one question on his President Wilson.
Oh, right. So, you see, people throw the great presidents as, Washington and Lincoln, maybe FDR's thrown in there. And the big thing with Lincoln and FDR is that they saw through the Civil War and World War II, respectively. And you could say that Wilson saw us through World War I, but he is just seen as the worst president by it seems a good amount of. Again, this is a few people on YouTube I've seen tier lists, and so it's not like I've done a bunch of research and I've found the greatest historians' opinions and seen it there. But it seems like he is not seen very highly, and this is probably one of the reasons.
And the flu kept killing.
All right, guys. Sorry if I was a bit less energetic that time, but I will be better next time. Doing episode 5 next. See you then.